Hello and welcome everyone to our event tonight. So I'm Kayla Brzezinski, the Assistant Director here at the Museum of the White Mountains. As we gather today, we are all on Indigenous lands. For those of you joining us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous presence in your area, both past and present. Those of us at the MWM are on Indakana, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. So we are grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you on Zoom, we have put some links in the chat where you can learn more excuse me, about the Indigenous histories of your place at nativeland.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of Northern New England through the Musée de Abenaki in Quebec. So last month, we learned from Dave Anderson about the important role played by the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forest in conservation on a landscape scale. So tonight, we will have a slightly different format. Instead of hearing from a single speaker, we are joined by representatives of the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust and the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust to help us understand the role of smaller land trusts in the bigger picture of conservation in and around the White Mountains. So while we find comfort in the fact that the White Mountain National Forest protects 800,000 acres and the Forest Society has conserved another 200,000 acres, we will talk tonight about how there is still more important work that needs to be done. So I'm especially excited for tonight's discussion as it's coming up on a year. It'll be a year in January that I've lived in New Hampshire. So I'm always eager to learn more about the state that I'm currently living in. And one major association that I have and that I've made with New Hampshire is just the sheer volume of forests, green spaces, parks, and farmland that is available and accessible here. So it seems like the access to land and preservation of it is something that is ingrained in folks from New Hampshire. So I'm excited to learn a little bit more about how exactly that's done. So to begin our conversation, I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves as well as their organizations. So we can begin.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Jen Pribble. I'm the Executive Director for Upper Saco Valley Land Trust. Upper Saco Valley Land Trust works to protect land from as far north as Hart's location through Jackson and Chatham, further south into Eaton, Madison, and eastward into Western Maine to include Freiburg, Brownfield, and Denmark. So we work to protect the Upper Saco Valley watershed, essentially, the headwaters of which are in the White Mountain National Forest. We have a staff of, I should back up. We are a nonprofit land trust. We are fully accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. We have a board of directors and a staff of 4 full-time employees and 2 part-time employees. We have, we protect almost 12,000 acres of land in our service area, most of which is conservation easements. And about 3,000 acres of that we own in fee. We'll talk about that later. This is Mike Morin. He's our conservation director, and I thought you might explain a little more about what you do in your role.
Yeah, for sure. As a conservation director for the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust, my primary role is to work with landowners that are interested in conserving their land. And so meeting with landowners, sharing the tools we have in our land trust toolbox to conserve properties. And then also on the stewardship side of our work, helping to lead our stewardship team to manage the lands that we own, as well as follow through the responsibilities we have as a land trust to manage the conservation easements that we hold.
Pretty much the same.
Same.
No, we're Dave and I are with the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust, and we're kind of on the other side of the state from these guys. They're on and in the main border, and we border the Connecticut River side. And so ACT was formed, I think it was 6 people. There was a nice piece of property in Sugar Hill, New Hampshire, that was going to be developed, nice wooded lot. And 6 people got together and bought it and started Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust in 2000. And then they worked with the New England Forestry Foundation and put an easement on the property. And that's where ACT was born. And we now have either fee or easement properties in 14 towns. And we've just moved in, the last 4 months, 6 months, moved more into Greater Coös County. Before we were mostly in the Ammonoosuc River watershed and kind of up and down the Connecticut River a little bit. But we've just branched out to take in most of Coös County. We already had 2 properties in Coös, one in Lancaster, one in Whitefield, but now we're working with landowners up in Stratford and Stewarttown and Clarksville.
Yep.
Yeah. So we are being on the road more and more. So, but yeah, we're as far as properties goes, about half the size of these guys. We've got about 5,300 acres, with 4,000 of that being in easement and the rest in fee. But with a move into Coös County, that's about to go up. We've got about 17, almost 1,800 acres in with applications in, and most of that's in Coös County. So, or a lot of that's in Coös County. So we're going to be busier and busier, it looks like, which is a good thing. I think more and more people are finding out about conservation easements and conservation organizations like us. And there is, I think people are seeing more and more pressure on breaking up parcels that have been in families for decades, generations. So.
Yeah, so I'm Dave Falkenham. I live in Coös County. I'm a conservation ecologist in Coös County for ACT. And primarily I work a very light part-time schedule and primarily work once a land project is started. So once an application is in, I do a lot of the work, doing the analysis on the property, determining conservation values and so forth, and all the little on the land features that make that property valuable as a conservation project. So that funders and so forth that are going to help fund the project take a high interest in it. And I work some with the landowners, meet one-on-one with the landowners, but do spend a lot of time largely on the land base with myself and our other ecologist, Jesse, to just kind of tease out all those really important parts. Like why does this piece of land, why is it so valuable for conservation? And we try to put that into writing and bring it forth. So there's many things we look at, wetlands, rare plants, rare wildlife, rare habitats, mountains, swamps, all these things that we want to protect, and then connectivity with other protected lands. So if a piece is out on its own, sitting and kind of floating out in space, there may be a higher value on another property that's actually connected to an already protected land, like a state land or a federal land. So we try to create those travel corridors for wildlife and so forth.
I can jump back in for a second. I should have said that we have 10 staff, 5 part-time, 5 full-time, and lots of volunteers. And we couldn't do the work without the volunteers. But should say right now, we'll talk a lot about conservation values. And when we're working on a project, we have 2 kinds of values. There's a monetary value to the property and a conservation value. And the conservation values have very little to do with the monetary value. In fact, I think they probably work against each other, because the monetary value is how can this be subdivided? you know.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I think maybe to get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about how your organizations conserve land. There were a couple of terms that were sort of introduced during those introductions. Easement is one, and fee land was another. So how do you define what these words mean, and how are they applicable in the context of how your organization conserves land?
Sure. I would say that I'll just start with saying that those are definitions that are sort of universally accepted across organizations. So what we call a fee land, ACT calls a fee land. You might hear another organization just say, call it a preserve, or call it just a land that they own. But a fee land is a property that is owned by the land trust. And once we define conservation easement, you'll understand, but they can also have a conservation easement on them. So who would like to define a conservation easement?
Go for it.
I'll go get a stab. So when we're working, okay, quick, like Jen said, a fee owned, it's easy. We own it. A conservation easement, we do not own the property. What we have taken over is mostly the development rights, mostly the right to subdivide the property and build on it. There are other things. There are reserved rights and rights the property owner gives up. It can be, they can do it, they can donate the conservation easement, they can sell the conservation easement, or what most often happens is the landowner will do what we call a bargain sale, and they'll take a reduced price from the appraised value of the property. But a conservation easement, the landowner, the owner still owns the property. They can sell the property. They can still do some things on the property, a lot of things on the property. But what they've done with the conservation easement is give up some of the things that they can do on the property. And it also, it gives the landowner the opportunity to put their stamp on the property forever. Because the conservation easement is in perpetuity. It lasts forever. It moves with the deed to the property, and the restrictions go with that, with any sale of the property. So the main things about an easement are you give up some of the things you can do, you negotiate those and what can still be done on the property, working farm, working forest, recreation, whatever it might be. The owner still owns the property, can sell the property, but with those restrictions on the property.
If you think of land ownership as a bundle of rights, there's rights to cut wood, there's rights to mine gravel, there's rights to build roads, there's rights to develop and so forth. You, the owner, have those rights, and a conservation easement is basically purchasing a number of those rights. Usually development, as Rick said, gravel, road development. So the easement purchases those rights, so the owner doesn't have those anymore, but they maintain the right for timber and so forth, and usually negotiate how those are going to take place in perpetuity.
Yeah, and an interesting thing about, I think, conservation easements and the fact that ride with the land is, we're seeing this now, having been in existence for about 20 years. We're seeing land changing hands, maybe now in the first time in a generation. And so part of our job now, educating new landowners, whether it's an outside entity that's purchased property, or even siblings or heirs that have inherited the land, and kind of giving folks, having conversations with folks about what a conservation easement means. We might have had that conversation 20 years ago with their parents or the previous owner, but it's kind of, you have to go through that continued kind of education process, and you really are building a relationship, if you're doing it right, I think, with the folks that have opted to enter into that, or opted to encumber the land with an easement. We really are kind of partners in that work.
I think the thing to add maybe now is that it's our responsibility as the easement holder to monitor the land. So we have to monitor all of our easements every year. And so we have volunteers and staff, but love our volunteers for going out onto the properties and making sure that the properties are being used in accordance with the easement, right? So that the things that they said they wouldn't be doing, they're not doing. The things they said that they would, we can, tell them great work. And we can also have some of those conversations with them about maybe best practices. They might come to us and say, oh my gosh, I've heard about the spongy moss or the emerald ash borer. Like, what do I need to do? What do I need to know? And we can be a resource for them.
And part of that relationship also is like, you meet with them, you're talking, they're gonna do this. Well, do you know about the NRCS program? It'll fund part of that, or this, that, or the other. So yeah, it becomes almost like family. I mean, you really get to know the people and all, so, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for defining. So now that we have maybe a better sense of how land sort of comes under your care, can you talk about what happens next? So we heard some terms, monitoring and stewardship, that came up with introductions. So in your answer to this question, can you unpack these terms for us as well?
Yeah, so what comes next? Really, it's that stewardship piece, right? And every property is different. And when we acquire a property, we go through a process of creating a management plan that surveys the land for the resources it has, identifying sensitive resources, areas that we want to are of high value that we want to protect from a natural resource perspective. We might explore where it makes sense to bring people on the land. We might, at the same time, think about where we need to keep people maybe out of to protect maybe particularly sensitive resource. And yeah, it depends. Yeah, it just depends on the property in a lot of ways. We have an example, and we have a community forest in North Conway, Pine Hill Community Forest, where we've been building trails and working with the community to kind of develop more opportunities for outdoor recreation. But we have lands elsewhere that we're really thinking about it as an ecological preserve, where there's really unique species that we need to protect, and that land might not be appropriate, to have extensive trail network established on it. And so it really does come down to a case-by-case basis, and working with the communities where these lands are also to make sure that we're fitting into what they envision for the land, and trying to find a balance all around. And it really just comes down to really being deeply ingrained in the community and having lots of conversations, whether it's we're dealing with a private landowner or we have lands that we own. It's that conserving land for community benefit, is our motto, and that's that community part is key for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and part again, like say we're required by our certification. We're both certified by the same national organization that we visit the property at least once a year. And all part of the process is we look at a property and think, okay, how hard is it going to be to monitor this property? Mm-hmm. What kind of things might happen to it? Like we're working on a property now that is surrounded on 6 sides, because it's not square, but by like 2-acre lots.
Yeah,
That's going to take some monitoring. We're looking at another property way up in Stewartstown. You can't get there. So, so they differ, but it's all part of the budget that we build. How much time every year will it take? How much money will it take to monitor the property? How likely are we to have to defend the conservation easement in court? Say a new owner comes in and says, I don't care, I'm gonna build a Walmart. Or as Rosalind, or one of our other conservation project managers would say, we'll build a nuclear power plant, and well, you can't. Well, I'm gonna take you to court. Well, we have to have money to do that, even though we do have insurance for that, it still takes money. And so it's you develop the relationship with the owner, like we've been talking about. You work with the owner year in, year out, and then somebody new comes along, you start over. But it's all part. It's all the same and different at the same time. The process is the same, but the project intricacies can be different.
And I don't know what your experience has been, but I think, when we think about like a fundraising effort for a fee-owned land, I think one of the trickiest things to explain to the broader public sometimes is the need to fundraise for stewardship endowment funds,
Right.
for funds that manage the land, right? They're like, well, you're asking for like a couple $100,000 here. Well, we're obligated to manage this land in perpetuity, right? And so we take that responsibility very seriously.
Exactly.
It's not just buying
Right,
land.
exactly.
It's applying your costs to that land as
Right.
well, because you now
Yeah.
take stewardship of it.
Yeah.
And if ever one of the two organizations ever goes away and these projects get passed on to another that other organization won't take the
Right.
property if it doesn't have an endowment, doesn't have money to do the management,
Mhm.
whatever that be, whether it's a fee-owned land or whether it's an easement that needs to be monitored, they won't take it on unless that money is available.
And
So it has to be worked into the price. It's not just the sale price of the property.
Yeah, and that's always an interesting conversation with donated land or donated easement. It's like, well, we appreciate your gift, but there's.
But we still have to come up with
Yeah.
it, exactly. And they're like, that's a lot of money. So perpetuity is a long time.
Yeah.
And the idea is you want to be able to shepherd the property off the interest
Right.
of that, so that that money doesn't go away. It's in a dedicated account and can't use it for. Now. There we go. It can't be used for anything else. It has to be used for stewardship of the property. And there's actually, we use a calculator for, how far is it?
Yep.
How big is it? What's the likelihood of, another thing we look at in monitoring is not only is the property owner doing the right thing, is a neighbor doing the wrong thing?
Yep.
And somebody encroaching on the property. So.
And I think those properties, like you said, it's safe to just repeat that for those properties that have a lot of neighbors, they require maybe a closer look than properties that are a little more remote and have fewer people with easy access. So that's stewardship and monitoring. It does it's not an easy sell when you're asking donors to, make a commitment to support your organization, but it's the thing that we need the most really, is that, the projects are really fun to get excited about, but knowing that we need to do that.
All right, so during the introduction, I mentioned that the National Forest and the Forest Society have 1 million of New Hampshire's nearly 6 million acres of land that are actually conserved. So to play devil's advocate, I guess a little bit, why do we need to conserve more land? And what are your priorities moving forward within your particular service areas?
Yeah, I was thinking about that this morning as I was driving through Conway Village on the way to work. It's a good question. And I think one of the things that I think about is here in New England and Northern New England, particularly, we have a lot of private land that we're very accustomed to having access to as kind of a cultural norm. And as land changes hands, those norms can change and land access can go away. So one of our jobs or goals at the Land Trust is to maintain public access to lands that have been historically utilized by folks in the community. It's also, I think, the landscape that we all live in, I think many of us cherish. And so it's about maintaining that sort of quality of life and experience that we've come to kind of enjoy wherever it might be in our region or across the White Mountains and the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust region. And so, there's always a give and take. Like, we're never going to have so many resources that we're going to be able to kind of buy up all the land, right? There's always going to be development happening in concert with land conservation. And so we're just kind of, I think in some ways, it's kind of striking a balance and making sure that as growth occurs, we're also thinking about how we are setting aside land to kind of maintain the character of the places we love. And at the same time, we're also exploring opportunities where, when it makes sense, acquiring what we call trade land that we can actually maybe set aside and donate or sell to an organization like Habitat for Humanity that can build affordable housing. We had a project a couple of years ago, our Redstone Preserve, that had about a 10-acre parcel that didn't really have a lot of ecological value. It kind of historically been utilized and how it's just been kind of used, right, by humanity. And so it made sense to subdivide that 10 acres off and sell it to Habitat for Humanity for affordable housing, retaining the remaining acreage for conservation. And so again, it's about finding that balance. And we went on a site visit yesterday where initially I thought, oh, this might be one of those projects, but it turned out it had really high conservation value. So we're like kind of are going that direction with it. So it's just about kind of always assessing what the highest and best use is and keeping an open mind.
And I think if I can just piggyback off of what you said, that it is about, thinking about smart development, but thinking about, knowing what your resources are and having that connection with your community and knowing which pieces of land are really like highly valued by the members of your community. And we also, in 2022, had a strategic conservation plan put together for our organization, and it really went through and did a natural resources inventory for the region. We are really looking at making sure that when we're tackling projects that we evaluate them through the lens of that conservation plan and through the priorities that were set for us. So there are basically 4 major priorities. So it's water, so clean drinking water, clean rivers and streams and ponds and bogs, and it was ecological integrity. So those are our forests, our wildlife. It's open spaces and scenic views, so for people, and farmland. So we have limited. What's great about farmland is that, one, you have food for the future, right? And Northern New England is not, the farmland that we have is great because it's already been cleared of boulders and all of the things that made, initially farming here really, really hard. The thing that's a real risk for farmland is that also makes it really easy to build on. And so, we have along West Side Road, the Saco River runs right along that, and it's beautiful. And there's great farmland there. And we want to be able to help keep it farmland so we can have, even if it's just being hayed for the livestock that are, being maintained, that's great. But it can be farmland for the future, even if it's not being actively produced for vegetables. And then also just in Western Maine, the Freiburg area, that's another farmland rich that's feeling a lot more development pressure.
Yeah, and I'll just to piggyback that on again. I mean, the White Mountain National Forest has did an amazing job of conserving a lot of headwaters in our region, the Saco River, but there remain unconserved riparian corridors outside of the forest that really are in need of conservation to make sure that we're protecting our aquifer and to keep the integrity of the entire watershed intact. And so, we're working on a project right now called Chain of Ponds in Madison that's going to protect 625 acres of land that includes kettle bogs and ponds and streams and 300 plus acres of aquifer, and is headwaters into Silver Lake, which is a very cherished lake in our region for its water quality. And so our work will help to make sure that that is maintained. Whereas if it was sold, it could become a gravel mine. It could be because there's a lot of glacial esker deposits on the property that are really cherished by gravel operations. And so just, making sure, looking at those opportunities to kind of protect what we have and make sure that the integrity of the things we love are kind of maintained.
Yeah.
It's important. It's important to, yes, 1 million acres are conserved in New Hampshire, but has the use for those, the human use on those properties, those conserved properties, has it gone down? In fact, I would say it's skyrocketed, especially in the last bunch of years. So again, as was said earlier, maintaining public access to more land. So the pressure, the human pressure on the national forest and our state forests and so forth has just gone through the roof over the last few years. I mean, it's really quite amazing. And it's wonderful to see people in that use, but you want to, you know, continue that dialogue of public access. And also at the same time, those other important resources, wildlife ecology, water protection and so forth, we need to have conserved lands where not that many people go, that are conserved for other reasons, not as tangible. But it's pretty easy to see the land use skyrocketing, the need for public access skyrocketing, and then at the same time, the need for protection of those non-tangible resources that we actually really do need.
And one thing about a conservation easement, and it'll depend on the funder and the owner, is public access is not required. Now, all our fee-owned land is open to the public, and even most of it for hunting, which we do by our ecologists see what the carrying capacity is, and we do it by permit. So might be one property that has 5 permits, might be a bigger property with 10, might be one with 2. But as far as the conservation easement properties, it can be up to the landowner. Again, depending on the funder, whether or not they open it up to public access or post it. So, but a lot of what we do, a major part of our mission is a working landscape. So again, it is protecting the farmland, and like you say, whether it's now in hay, whether it's not, if it's being mowed every 2 years, just to keep it from growing in. Again, we with the Ammonoosuc River and particularly the Connecticut, you get some really nice floodplain soil. It's like a breadbasket, and like it's been said, it's the perfect place to build. It's flat, it's dry, it's good soil, no rocks.
Exactly.
But yeah, so that's some of the opportunities and challenges for facing the land. Yeah, and you know, there are there's a lot of land in northern Coös County that's under easement with the state, and you know, not the White Mountain National Forest, and not the but it's like SPNF and Trust for Public Land. They can do the 1,000 acre, the 2,000 acre. They can do, would say 100,000 acres that they have. We can't do that. The 20 acre, they don't do the 200 acre. They call us, you know, and literally. So we're in that niche where you've got the big organizations that can do big properties, and then you've got us that work on a much smaller scale, but no less important.
Correct.
And often we're adding to existing conservation blocks that have been done, you know, the work that's been done by the TNC or others. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the project we're working up in Stewarttown is surrounded by conserved land. It's just a block out in the middle. Another one we're working on in Easton is surrounded on 3 sides by the White Mountain National Forest. It's 40 acres. You know, who cares? We do. The owner does. You know, she's donating it. And it's one of those projects that's so nice. To donating in fee and all the costs that go with it.
Bravo.
Where that's a very rare opportunity to have.
Yeah. And some of those smaller pieces of land might have really incredible ecological resources. And they are, you know, for those larger organizations, they are just too small to fit into their work.
Or the process might be too cumbersome for a small landowner to kind of work through with a federal land manager. I've been involved in other land trust work where we buy it and hold it and then sell it to the federal to be included with the national forest, or perhaps work with the state to acquire it after the fact. So there's a hold and transfer component that we haven't done, I don't think, at USVLT, but it does get done on occasion by land trusts or around the country.
Yeah, I think the first easement under this cost initiative is 30 acres. So,
but they want it to be a wild land. They don't want it to be touched, so that it can go as natural as it can in a disturbed environment. And the one I've been talking about up in Stewartstown, it's got, what is it, 80 acres of forest that's going towards old growth.
yeah, it's pushing old growth hard. You know,
Nice.
it's as close to old growth hardwood as you're probably gonna get in Coös County. You know, outside of real high elevation stuff. I mean, it's not high elevation, it's normal elevation.
Okay.
Really
And-
impressive stand of maple.
And it'll be managed as old growth forest,
Mhm.
where softwood areas might be managed for timber harvest in the future. So,
Interesting. Actually, I had a sort of question to branch off of that. Could you talk more about the process in sort of determining or the determination of what like newly acquired land could be for? Because you sort of mentioned like this could be for ecology, this could be for farmland, this could be for public access. What's that process like? I'm just sort of curious.
On our end, we go through kind of a phased kind of approach to assessing the land. So it starts with a site visit, meeting with the landowners and kind of getting to understanding what the land is, what it has to offer. Then my job is to take all that information, either that I've gleaned from the landowner and other online resources to the state and federal government to kind of put together a summary of what the property summary, kind of outlining the natural resource values. Or perhaps the trail connectivity values, whatever the land might offer. And so as we kind of go through the process, we have a land committee that reviews all of our projects prior to kind of giving the go forth to kind of really pursue it in earnest. And then through the course of that work, we kind of come up with a strategy on what we think that land can be, best used for from a conservation or recreation perspective. What the highest value is from that on those kind of two, always kind of balancing uses, if you will. And so through that process, then that kind of informs our management planning process, and that really kind of guides the organization towards the direction that we're going to go with that particular piece of land.
it's same with us, that's what Dave does, and Jess Moore, our other ecologist and forester, is somebody will call the office. The office will give us the information, the project managers will contact the owner. And if it sounds like something they want to act on pretty quickly, then one of these guys will go out, evaluate the property for the conservation values, not the monetary, but the conservation values. And then all of that goes into how the easement, if it's an eased property, how the easement deed will be written up. You know, we're looking at a property now that has well, beyond the one we're talking about with the old growth, there's another one that has an oak ash area that's somehow enriched, and it'll probably be in the deed to manage that differently than the rest of the forest on the property.
A
So,
lot of it's landowner wishes.
yeah,
So this one in Stewartstown, with the older growth hardwood, it was the request of the landowner that he couldn't remember. It'd been in his family forever, and he couldn't remember it being cut. He wanted that to continue. So we will continue that. That's sort of our duty to his legacy. So the landowner has a lot of say in determining whether it's an easement or a fee. That's a fee that we will own, but he has a lot to say along the way as to how he wants it handled. And then he said, as Rick was saying, the softwood, that's fine, you can manage that, but the hardwood, it's in a perfect position to just leave alone. And he said that's the way he wants it. And it's the same with an easement as well. So the landowners that currently own it that we were working with have a lot to say in future management.
and you know, sometimes a landowner might want something that we just can't do. And if they've got to have that, then we have to walk away, and we have in the past. A lot of times you work with the landowner and you can come to some kind of compromise that works for everybody and protects the values of the property, the conservation values. And we also have to keep in mind what the grantors want, what the people that are the funds that are going to fund the property, what they have special things they want. The drinking water, groundwater trust fund wants certain things. LCHIP wants certain things. The Moose Plate wants certain things. And if you're going for all of those, there's not much left.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. Like when you're looking at, so LCHIP, we might talk about, do you remember the full acronym? It's the
Land and Community Heritage Investment Program.
Yeah.
Bravo. So it's a state funding, right? It's a state funding opportunity. And they just made their awards for the year this week. And they protect, the awards go for land conservation and historic preservation in the state. And one of their big components and requirements is public access. So if you have a landowner who does not want to open public access on their land, then it's not a good fit. So it's our job to know that background about each of these so that we can build out a good fundraising strategy for the projects.
Yeah, it goes back to that on conservation easements, that education piece. It starts at the beginning and never ends.
And like the Drinking Water Trust Fund, it's no motorized traffic, no herbicides, pesticides, that kind of thing. So it's hard to use that on a working farm in a lot of locations, and that we have on some small plots, but we're looking at one now that's 70 acres of undeveloped forest land. It's perfect. They don't plan to do anything with it, but timber manage. So it's a perfect fit for that funder. So, it's a very intricate operation developing one of these projects. Take it if it's a great piece of land, they want to donate everything, it can be done pretty quickly. But in most cases, for us anyway, it's 2 years minimum, and it's probably going to get longer as the more and more people are wanting to conserve property, which is a good thing.
We found with some of the funding cycles too, it's longer, more like 3 if you're, depending on the particular project. So if somebody's interested, I would say you can always ask questions and do sort of fact finding and know that it's not something you have to rush into, that it is a process. So
and it is, because what's very important is once that deed is signed, I mean, it's a contract, and it's a contract that lasts forever. So we work with the landowners to, most of the time, particularly if it's like a working farm, they pretty much know what they want. And somebody else may have inherited or just bought a big piece of forest land, and it might not be something they grew up with. They might not know the opportunities that are there for them. And so it can be, and I also learn anytime I'm working with a landowner. If they know a lot about their land, I learn about their land. And that's one of the many, I like to say I enjoy 87% of my job. And and that's one of the fun parts is working with the landowner through the process.
Yeah, having the privilege of being invited on to people's property to see some really cool, landscapes. I mean, whether it's at the initial phase of a project, or you're, a decade in and you're going out just to have a ride around the property. It's always pretty amazing.
Yeah. And that's kind of how we sell monitoring to our volunteers.
good job.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So we've talked a lot tonight about you and your staffs and what your organizations do. I want to shift now to talk about how members of our audience can get involved with what you're doing.
You guys want to kick it off?
Sure. Look at our website. No, but there is a state website. The New Hampshire Coalition of Land Trusts has a website that's interactive, and you can put your town in there, and it will tell you which land trust or land trusts in many cases work in that area, because there are some overlaps. And there's also an interactive map you can look at, and it's dynamic. It keeps being updated and updated. It's not always in perfectly current, but that'd be one way to see which land trust to approach. Or we've had people 50 miles out of our service area call us, and I'll pull up that map and say, oh, talk to so-and-so at such and such. And but that'd be the first step is if you know somebody with conserved land, talk to them. And otherwise find out who's working in your area.
And pick up the phone. or email.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how it gets started. Or walk in the office, if you live near the office.
And even if you're not sure it's something you want to do, but you want to learn about, that's how I got involved with ACT. Is we bought some property. I knew of conservation easements, but I didn't know about them. So I got on with ACT, learned about them, and we put our property in an easement. And then they hired me. So, but you don't, even if you just want to know more about conservation easements and what the opportunities are, what the advantages are for the property, talk to somebody at a land trust.
Yeah.
We're not selling a product, you know. We're a big part of our missions are educating folks on this kind of thing.
I would say that, yeah, if you made an inquiry with another conservation organization and it's not in their service area, they're absolutely, like, we're all very well connected and would be happy to put people in with the right people. But yep, visit our website, usvlt.org. And volunteering is a great way to get involved. Whether you, want to go out and do work on a property by helping out with monitoring or helping with, some trail work, or if you have a skill that's not land-based, if you happen to be like really into finance or really into telling stories or really into organizing files, like there are lots of things that people can do to help out their local land trust or another nonprofit. We're always across the board looking for people who want to get involved in any way.
We were talking out in the hall and we have pretty much the same committees.
Yeah.
We have Finance Committee, Development Committee, Lands Committee, Board of Trustees, and they're all volunteers. And so, but when we do a conservation easement, just like they were talking about earlier, it gets vetted in-house. Once the staff gets to a point, we'll take it to the Lands Committee. It's got to go through a 4-page checklist. And then questions are asked and everything. And if the Lands Committee agrees it's a good project, then it gets sent up to the Board of Trustees. And they have to say yes. And then we can proceed with the project. So it's not something the land trust just jumps into. It's a process.
I noticed, I think we have is that a new chat in the?
I think we do.
Yes,
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
It's great. Yeah, so speaking of, we can take a question and answer section. So if we have any questions from anyone here in person or anyone who's online, you can write your question into the chat or you can unmute yourself and speak. It's up to you.
well, we are the local land trust.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, yeah.
So, we're the,
Come on up.
Penny Baker.
Okay, sure.
And so we serve, the Baker River Valley and what we call the Mid-Penny, Valley. That's our watershed catchment area. And, we're very small. We have maybe 1,200 acres that we've, put in easements around from Thornton to Wentworth to Dorchester, Plymouth, Romney. One of the things that I think is, well, first of all, we're all volunteers. We have no paid staff. So that slows the process down for us. But one of the things you haven't mentioned that I think would be useful for people to hear is that we have had very good success by making very good partnerships with conservation easements in the various towns that we serve. And actually, the conservation easements, the Conservation Commission is actually, the towns own some property that we then hold the easement on. And it's a way for the communities to preserve what they see as being the properties that they would like to see in the easement. And then we can work with the Conservation Commissions to actually put the easement on that property. So we've used the Campbell Conservation Commission, the Romney Conservation Commission, and various, so So I'm the landowner person and she's the monitor. So then we have
Awesome.
a committee of about
Great.
12 people that do all the work, so.
I think, can I add to that? That work with working with municipalities and easements, I think that's so important. And I think more towns and maybe residents and voters are realizing that the town land isn't permanently protected just by being owned by the town.
Yes.
And by working with your local land trust to put an easement on it,
Right.
then it's protected and it's ensured that in 20 years, when the town leadership changes their ideas about what are important to protect, you know that that land is still there. So I'm so glad to hear you're doing that.
We're actually working with the town for that very reason. They realized, oh,
Right.
this could be sold.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we do, I'm glad you brought that up, because we do work with conservation commissions and select boards, and we look at the town master plan and see what we want to do.
That's one of the things when we assess on property, that's one of the things that we check.
Yeah. And even some of the funders want to know that. They want to know what pages in the town master plan support this action. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's so good. If you're thinking about, we've talked a little bit about smart development, right? So if towns have gone through the master planning process and they know kind of where they want to, the areas that are important to them, then we should be looking at that resource. So.
You might want to explain, or maybe the difference between a deed restriction and a conservation easement.
You can put a deed restriction on something, but who's gonna make sure that happens? That's the biggest difference. Who's gonna enforce that deed restriction? And most often it's nobody. Because 2 generations down, nobody's gonna remember it's there except the guy holding the deed, and he has the bulldozer or whatever. So yeah, that's kind of the way I look at it. A deed restriction is great until it's not. A conservation easement has somebody looking out for it. So is that your experience with it?
Absolutely. And it's sad because people think that a deed restriction is a simple way of protecting property. And it's a simple way of protecting property, but it's not.
In the short term.
You don't have that other outside organization making sure that the rules that you set out are being, followed.
Who made the restriction and who's holding on to the enforcement of it? Usually. Maybe the landowner who sold it and is now passed away. There goes your enforcement.
And I don't know if it is for you all, but for many of the lands that we own in fee lands, we have an outside conservation easement holder on the property. So we have a property in Jackson and Bartlett called the Dundee Community Forest, and we own that property, but the state of New Hampshire holds the easement on the property.
Some of our properties have easements with New England Forestry Foundation. Conservation Commission might hold the easement. We've got a couple of those. And then we have some fee properties that we don't have easements on at this time. So we might put one on later.
Yeah. Yeah, the former ED of USVLT used to call it the belt and suspenders approach to land conservation, kind of that double layer of protection.
Yeah.
Those are such good points. What else do you
It's the
have?
same thing as property that's in current use. It's temporarily protected until someone with a big pocket that is willing to spend the penalty fee, and then it's not.
And that's that brings up something that often gets asked is, when I put my property in an easement, will my taxes go down? No, it's going to be the current use rate as a rule. So if they don't have it in current use, we try and educate them. Why don't you have it in current use? And the other thing is any act owned property, we pay taxes on. We don't just because we're a nonprofit. I think there's some ways we could get around paying property taxes, but we pay full property taxes on our all our fee-owned properties. Again, so otherwise we're taking money out of the town coffer.
Same, yeah, it's kind of a, I wouldn't say it's the best practice, but it's recommended, right? So you don't kind of poison the well around like thinking that conservation is gonna somehow undermine, the fiscal status of the town.
So, and we have a funny way of threading that too, but they're payments in lieu of taxes, since we're tax exempt, so we call them payments in lieu of taxes, but they're equal to the tax amount.
That may be what we do, but I'm not on that committee.
No, but I think it's really important that like so many of the conservation organizations here in the state of New Hampshire, I mean, we recognize that we're part of the community, and because we're part of the community, we feel it's important to continue to meet that obligation.
And I think, some people think or assume we don't pay taxes because we're tax exempt, right? And I've definitely had that question from folks that are maybe skeptical of a project, you know, and you have to like, it's education, right? Like, we actually do pay the tax rate.
Tax bills were due today. Sign
Paid them in Jackson today.
Now, I do also think I think it's still in the books, but in some towns, I think it's gonna be approved by the town. But if you have a property that's under 10 acres and you put an easement on it, then you can be taxed at the current use rate. So that could be an advantage for a small landowner that has a piece of property with high conservation values on it.
Some of the towns that we work with, when there is a current use penalty paid, some of that portion of that funds goes into a fund that can be used for conservation.
Yeah, the town I live in Bath, it's 100% goes in, and we tap those resources.
Absolutely. Yeah, land use change tax. Yeah, it's a great tool for conservation. Sure.
If you can get your tenant.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, some do 50%, some do more, some do less, some do none.
Yeah, it's interesting to have those conversations at the town level. If you have an interest in conservation, you know, going to the Conservation Commission meetings and learning about what happens to that money and advocating in your town for how that money can be spent, I think is a way that you can also have an impact on conservation in your community. And they're like usually really interesting meetings to attend.
Often learn a lot more than you meant to when you went in.
Exactly. Exactly.
Great. Do you have any other questions or comments here? We have any in the chat either. All right, any final thoughts?
We must have done a good job.
Yeah.
All right. I'm really enjoying this map behind you of our service areas. It's pretty cool.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for everyone for participating tonight, and thank you so much to our members and to everyone for attending tonight's event. So we will have this available on YouTube soon, hopefully tomorrow. And we also encourage active participation and support for each of our organizations. So we put a few links in the chat for folks at home to learn more about us and how to get involved, hopefully. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much for coming too. So yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.